If you've ever dated or known a woman who says she doesn't really have female friends, you probably felt two things at the same time: curiosity and caution. Part of you sees independence, strength, low drama. Another part of you wonders what happened. Women are socially wired to bond with other women. When that bond is missing, it's not random, it's psychological. It points to early imprinting, identity formation, defense structures, and sometimes unresolved wounds that will show up in your relationship with her. Today we're breaking down what it really means when a woman stands outside female circles, whether it signals depth and individuation, or isolation shaped by unhealed patterns. This isn't gossip, it's pattern recognition. And if you understand it, you'll start seeing her and yourself differently. There is a specific type of woman who walks into a room and feels the temperature shift. Not because she is loud, not because she is dramatic, but because she does not synchronize. Conversations continue, but something subtle misaligns. Smiles are exchanged, but they do not root. Invitations almost form, then dissolve. And after years of this, she begins to ask a dangerous question: what is wrong with me? If you are watching this, you may not be that woman. You may be the man trying to understand her, or you may recognize the pattern in someone close to you. Either way, here is the uncomfortable truth. When a woman consistently has few or no female friends, it is rarely random, it is rarely simple, and it is almost never about basic social incompetence. Something deeper is operating. From the outside, it looks like social failure. From the inside, it feels like chronic exclusion. But beneath both is an identity fracture that began early and never fully healed. The fracture is quiet. It does not scream. It reorganizes. As a child, she noticed she did not mirror the other girls correctly. They bonded through shared codes, subtle competition, unspoken alliances. She watched, studied, attempted entry. Sometimes she succeeded temporarily, but something in her presence destabilized the equilibrium. She asked different questions. She reacted differently. She did not participate in certain rituals of bonding that rely on shared insecurity or controlled performance. This is where most observers make the first mistake. They assume she lacks warmth, or softness, or adaptability. But the real issue is structural. She does not instinctively trade authenticity for belonging. And that single trait disrupts collective feminine dynamics more than anyone admits. You need to understand what that costs. A woman without female allies becomes exposed, socially unshielded. Without the protection of group affiliation, she feels visible in the wrong way, and invisible in the ways that matter. She sees other women move in coordinated clusters, reinforcing one another's identity, validating one another's choices, amplifying one another's presence. She stands outside that structure. At first, she tries to adapt. She moderates herself, softens edges, speaks less, laughs at things that do not move her, pretends not to see undercurrents of rivalry or insecurity. But the nervous system does not lie. Over time, the body tightens before social events. Energy drains faster. A subtle withdrawal begins. This is not shyness. It is pattern recognition. Carl Jung observed that when early relational wounds occur within the maternal field, the psyche reorganizes around protection rather than attachment. If the first experience of the feminine was inconsistent, competitive, emotionally cold, or subtly rejecting, The internal template becomes unstable. Later, when she approaches groups of women, the body anticipates threat before the mind can rationalize safety. So she does something that looks like isolation. But isolation is not always avoidance. Sometimes it is unconscious self-preservation. Here's the part no one says out loud. Women with few or no female friends often trigger projection. Other women sense something in them that does not bend, something that does not require collective approval to exist. That independence reads as judgment, even when no judgment is present. It activates comparison. It destabilizes hierarchy, and hierarchies protect themselves. Exclusion rarely happens through open hostility. It happens through omission, forgotten invitations, inside jokes that never reach her, subtle emotional distancing, nothing dramatic enough to confront, just enough to reinforce distance. After enough repetitions, she internalizes the pattern. She stops trying, not because she does not care, but because repeated micro-rejection erodes initiative. The psyche concludes, connection with women equals depletion. This is where the identity disruption begins. She starts building a self that does not rely on female affirmation. She becomes self-contained, self-referencing, emotionally private. From the outside, this can look strong, independent, even intimidating. But inside, a tension grows. Because human beings are not designed for total social detachment, especially not within their own gender. The absence of mirroring creates a specific type of psychological hunger. It does not disappear. It hardens. And here is the destabilizing possibility. What if her isolation is not simply misfortune, but the early stage of differentiation? What if the reason she never fully bonded is because her psyche refused to merge into a structure that required self-betrayal? That idea is dangerous. Because if it is true, then her loneliness is not evidence of defect. It is evidence of divergence. And divergence has consequences. Some women break themselves to belong. Others remain intact and walk alone. The world praises the first. It quietly punishes the second. So the question is not whether she has friends. The real question is what part of her refused to fracture in order to keep them, and what that refusal is going to cost her next. If you look at this pattern without sentiment, the structure becomes clear. This is not about popularity. It is about psychological alignment. When a woman repeatedly fails to bond deeply with other women, we are observing a system that is not syncing with the collective field. That misalignment usually begins with the maternal imprint. Jung described the mother as the first embodiment of the feminine archetype. Not just a parent, a psychic blueprint. If the mother was emotionally unpredictable, competitive, critical, cold, or overwhelmed, the daughter does not simply feel hurt. She reorganizes around vigilance. The nervous system learns that feminine closeness is unstable. Intimacy with women becomes associated with subtle threat. This does not create loud trauma. It creates controlled distance. Now, here is where ego defense enters. If a woman is repeatedly excluded, ignored, or subtly rejected by other women, the psyche must protect itself from humiliation. It does this through rationalization. I don't need female friends. Women are too much drama. I prefer being alone. Some of this may be partially true, but often it is layered over something deeper: emotional fatigue. Repeated micro-rejection drains the system. The body anticipates disappointment before connection begins. Over time, she stops initiating, not because she lacks desire, because she has calculated the cost. This is strategic withdrawal, and strategic withdrawal feels powerful at first. It restores control, it removes exposure, it eliminates the risk of social humiliation, but it also creates invisibility. Here is the silent threat no one names. Invisibility becomes identity. When a woman stands outside female networks, she loses access to social amplification. Groups elevate one another. They validate appearance, choices, milestones, motherhood, relationships. Without that reinforcement, she becomes structurally independent, but socially peripheral. And that peripheral position carries a psychological weight. Irrelevance, not dramatic irrelevance, quiet irrelevance. The feeling of watching collective experiences unfold without being part of the memory. Holidays, weddings, inside jokes, shared narratives. She becomes the observer of community rather than a participant in it. Over time, the ego adapts. It develops superiority defenses. I'm different. I'm deeper. I'm not like them. Sometimes that is partially accurate. But when that belief becomes rigid, it prevents introspection. It blocks the question, what am I avoiding? Because here is the harder layer. Isolation is not always imposed. Sometimes it is unconsciously maintained. If early feminine bonding felt unsafe, she may subtly test new women. She may withhold vulnerability. She may scan for threat before offering warmth. Other women feel this guardedness instantly. They mirror it back. Connection stalls, then the original belief is reinforced. See? It always ends this way. This is repetition compulsion. The psyche recreates early relational dynamics in an attempt to master them. But without awareness, it simply deepens the groove. There is also a status dimension that cannot be ignored. Female social groups operate through subtle hierarchies: beauty, attention, relationship status, confidence, emotional intelligence. If a woman carries strong self-containment, high independence, or non-conforming energy, she disrupts these hierarchies. She cannot be easily placed, and what cannot be placed often gets excluded. But here is the part most people avoid. Sometimes the woman without friends carries unintegrated shadow, intensity, unprocessed resentment, emotional sharpness disguised as authenticity. When she says she just tells the truth, she may be bypassing tact. When she says she doesn't do drama, she may actually withdraw at the first sign of conflict instead of navigating it. Individuation without humility becomes isolation, and this is the fork in the road. She can continue reinforcing the narrative that she is simply different and misunderstood. Or she can examine the entire structure honestly. The maternal wound, the ego defenses, the strategic withdrawal, the subtle superiority, the fear of re-experiencing rejection. This level of analysis is not common. Most people prefer blame. It is cleaner. It preserves pride. If this level of thinking feels rare where you are, subscribe. Not for comfort, for clarity. Because the next layer goes deeper. The absence of female friendship does not only affect social life, it alters identity formation. Women often refine themselves through other women. They experiment with appearance, language, vulnerability, boundaries inside relational feedback loops. Without those loops, development becomes internalized and solitary. That can create strength, but it can also create distortion. Without mirroring, self-perception drifts. She may overestimate her emotional self-sufficiency, or underestimate her relational blind spots. Both are forms of fragmentation. And fragmentation is subtle. It does not feel like collapse. It feels like quiet disconnection, a sense of being slightly out of phase with the collective rhythm of womanhood. Not hostile to it, just not inside it. The danger is not loneliness. The danger is crystallization. If she locks into the identity of the one who stands alone, she may stop evolving. The isolation that once protected her becomes the cage that defines her. And that is where the old identity begins to strain under its own weight. Because the question is no longer why she has no friends. The question is what this isolation is restructuring inside her, and whether she is consciously participating in that restructuring, or letting it harden into fate. At some point, the old explanation stops working. It's just bad luck. They're just insecure. I don't have time for shallow people. Those narratives lose stability when the pattern repeats across cities, stages of life, environments. Different faces, same outcome. That is when the deeper realization begins to press against the ego. The issue is structural. The identity she built to survive exclusion no longer functions the way it used to. Independence once felt powerful. Now it feels heavy. Emotional privacy once felt mature. Now it feels isolating. Self-containment once felt superior. Now it feels like a wall she no longer remembers building. This is where collapse begins. Not visible collapse, internal. The persona she constructed, the composed, self-sufficient, unaffected woman, starts to crack under accumulated silence. Because beneath it, there is still a human need for resonance, for shared language, for being seen by someone who understands her internal terrain without explanation. But here is the conflict. If she lowers the wall, she risks re-entering the original wound. If she keeps the wall, she guarantees continued isolation. This is psychological tension at its highest level. The old identity model cannot produce connection, but dismantling it feels dangerous. Solitude now shifts from preference to confrontation. When she sits alone, she can no longer fully blame the outside world. She begins to notice patterns in her own behavior. The way she scans for insincerity too quickly. The way she withdraws at the first micro shift in tone. The way she interprets ambiguity as rejection before evidence appears. The nervous system is still operating from old data. And here is the uncomfortable layer. Some women without female friends are not merely victims of exclusion. They are also unconsciously avoiding intimacy that would require emotional exposure. True female bonding is not built only on shared activities. It is built on shared vulnerability. That requires revealing insecurity, doubt, need. If her identity is organized around strength and non-neediness, the level of exposure threatens self-image. So the system protects itself by maintaining subtle distance. This is where the old self begins to collapse, because the strong, solitary woman identity once provided dignity. Now it prevents growth. The psyche does not tolerate stagnation forever. It will create pressure, restlessness, irritability, a sense that something is incomplete. She may start feeling disconnected not only from other women, but from herself. Because the self is not meant to remain frozen at one defensive stage. Withdrawal, in its first phase, was protection. In its prolonged phase, it becomes avoidance. And avoidance always accumulates cost. There is also a more subtle fear emerging here. If she attempts to rebuild and fails again, the wound will deepen. Repeated rejection after conscious effort feels more personal, more final. So she hesitates. She stays in the familiar discomfort rather than risk a sharper one. This is the moment of decision most people never consciously recognize. She can double down on isolation and refine it into identity. Or she can accept that the current structure is incomplete and risk restructuring. But restructuring is destabilizing. It requires admitting that some of the exclusion was projection from others, and some of it was guardedness from herself. It requires accepting that she may carry intensity that needs refinement, not suppression. It requires acknowledging that authenticity without attunement can feel abrasive, even if truthful. The old self resists this level of accountability. It prefers the cleaner narrative of being misunderstood. Yet something inside her knows that narrative has reached its limit. She begins to sense that her solitude is no longer punishment, nor superiority, but a transition phase, a dismantling. The identity formed around the wound is weakening. This is where many people panic. Because without the old structure, there is nothing familiar to stand on. And if she rebuilds incorrectly, if she swings into performative friendliness, people-pleasing, or desperate attachment, she will fracture in a different way. She will betray the part of her that refused to bend in the first place. So the pressure increases. Who is she without the defensive independence? Who is she without the rejection narrative? Who is she without the armor? Most will not go that far. They will stabilize in bitterness or quiet resignation. But if she continues, something reorganizes. Not softer, not louder, more precise. Before we go further, I want to see something. Comment the city you're watching from. Not for numbers, for observation. I want to see where this silent restructuring is happening, because this process is rarely discussed openly. It unfolds quietly in apartments, in parked cars, in late-night reflections after another social interaction that almost became something. The collapse of the old self is not dramatic. It is controlled implosion, and what replaces it will either be conscious construction or permanent isolation with better excuses. Now we remove the final layer of comfort. It is easy to blame the mother, easy to blame insecure women, easy to blame social hierarchies. There is truth in all of it. But truth without responsibility becomes stagnation. At some point, the external explanation must expire. If she continues to frame herself as the one repeatedly excluded by flawed systems, she locks herself into passive positioning. And passive positioning is psychological surrender disguised as insight. Victimhood is subtle here. It does not look dramatic. It looks analytical, self-aware. I understand projection. I understand shadow. I understand archetypes. But understanding dynamics is not the same as taking control of one's own behavior inside them. This is where discipline enters, not emotional suppression, not personality distortion. Discipline. Cognitive control means she challenges automatic interpretations. When a message is delayed, she does not instantly translate it into rejection. When a group dynamic shifts, she does not default to exclusion narrative. She pauses. She gathers evidence. She separates memory from reality. Most people never develop this muscle. They live inside their first interpretation. Behavioral consistency means she shows up more than once. Real connection is not built on one perfect interaction. It requires repetition, exposure, micro risks, If she withdraws at the first discomfort, she confirms her own isolation. Stability attracts stability. Inconsistency signals guardedness. Emotional containment means she does not unload intensity without calibration. Depth is not the problem. Timing is. If she introduces high emotional density before trust is built, others retreat. Not because they are shallow, because the system feels overloaded. This is not about becoming smaller. It is about becoming precise. Without structure, collapse turns into decay. If she dismantles the old identity but does not install discipline, she drifts. She oscillates between overexposure and withdrawal, between forced friendliness and silent resentment. That instability is felt by others immediately. Connection requires predictability, not boredom. Predictability. When others know what version of you they will meet, safety forms. When your energy fluctuates between guarded and intense, they remain cautious. Here is the hardest truth. Some women with few friends unconsciously signal superiority, not through words, through micro-expressions, through disengagement from group rituals, through subtle detachment that reads as evaluation. Even if she believes she is simply being authentic, the impact may communicate distance. Responsibility means she audits this honestly, not with shame, with precision. Does she ask questions about others or mostly respond? Does she initiate or wait to be pursued? Does she allow herself to be imperfect publicly or maintain controlled composure? Perfection is isolating. Approachability requires visible humanity. Breaking victimhood does not mean denying early wounds. It means refusing to let them dictate current strategy. The child who felt excluded does not get to run adult social decisions. If she wants different outcomes, she must tolerate new discomfort. That means risking being slightly misunderstood without retreating. Risking small rejection without globalizing it. Risking showing interest first. Risking warmth without guarantee. No one escapes this stage. Individuation without relational skill produces isolation. Relational skill without individuation produces conformity. The integration of both requires effort. Effort is not weakness. It is control. There is also an internal confrontation that must happen. If she claims she does not need female friendships, she must test that statement under pressure. When she sees groups bonding, does her body remain neutral, or does it tighten? The body reveals unmet desire long before the ego admits it. Honesty here prevents bitterness later. Because bitterness is the final stage of unmanaged isolation, it disguises itself as clarity. It sounds intelligent, but it corrodes openness. And once bitterness sets in, rebuilding becomes exponentially harder. This is why structure now matters. She sets measurable standards for herself. Initiate contact once per week. Attend events without immediate evaluation. Stay present through mild discomfort. Follow up even when the first interaction was average, not exceptional. Growth happens in the average, not in the perfect encounter. If she does this consistently, something shifts, not immediately, but gradually. Her nervous system recalibrates. The old anticipation of rejection weakens. The defensive posture softens without collapsing. And here is the critical distinction. She is not chasing belonging. She is building relational competence. Those are different objectives. Chasing belonging creates desperation. Building competence creates confidence. If this confrontation feels uncomfortable, good. It means the identity is reorganizing around strength instead of narrative. The isolation was not meaningless, but without disciplined reconstruction, it will calcify. And once it calcifies, the door narrows. Return to the beginning, the woman who walks into a room and feels the temperature shift. For years, she interpreted that shift as rejection, then as superiority, then as fate. Now she sees it differently. The shift was never only about them, it was about her structure. Isolation forced differentiation. Differentiation exposed defensive architecture. Defensive architecture demanded reconstruction. This was not random suffering. It was psychological separation from unconscious conformity. But separation is only stage one. Now comes deliberate construction. First, what must be eliminated? The identity of the permanent outsider. It feels protective, even noble, but it locks the nervous system into expectation of exclusion. That expectation shapes posture, tone, timing, facial expression. Others respond accordingly. Remove the narrative, and half the battle disappears. Eliminate superiority disguised as discernment. Yes, not every group is aligned. Yes, depth matters, but using depth as a shield prevents exposure. True strength does not require silent comparison to feel stable. Eliminate hypervigilance. Not naivety, not blindness, hypervigilance. The constant scanning for subtle shifts in energy. The body cannot connect while in surveillance mode. Relaxation is a skill. It must be trained. Second, what must be built? Relational stamina. The capacity to stay in interaction beyond initial discomfort. Most connections do not ignite immediately. They warm slowly. If she exits too early, she never reaches ignition. Social calibration, the ability to match intensity to context. Depth is valuable, but depth delivered without pacing overwhelms. Calibrated expression increases access without diluting authenticity. Visible warmth, not performance. Signals, eye contact that lingers, questions that expand, small affirmations that communicate interest. These micro-behaviors create safety. Safety builds familiarity. Familiarity builds trust. Internal validation. This is non-negotiable. If she still relies entirely on external mirroring to feel secure, she will oscillate between hunger and withdrawal. She must be able to leave an interaction and evaluate it without self-attack. That internal stability prevents desperation. Third, what must be endured? Temporary awkwardness. Not every attempt will land. Some women will still project. Some dynamics will still misalign. But now she does not collapse into narrative. She adjusts and continues. Slow growth. Real social repositioning takes time. Months, sometimes years. The nervous system requires repetition to update its predictions. Impatience will sabotage the process. Ambiguity. Not all connections become close friendships. Some remain contextual. That is not failure. That is social reality. And here is the resolution of the original tension. The temperature shift in the room may still happen, but now it is neutral data. She no longer enters with guarded intensity. She no longer scans for exclusion. She enters grounded, observant, open but structured. If alignment occurs, she cultivates it. If not, she moves without internalizing it. The difference is internal sovereignty without isolation. This is the mature form of individuation. Not separation from the collective, not fusion with it, integration within it. She can belong without dissolving. She can stand alone without hardening. She can connect without performing. That is power, not loud, not visible to everyone, but stable. The woman who once believed she was socially defective now understands she was psychologically early. Early in differentiation, early in awareness, early in refusing unconscious bonding. But awareness without skill isolated her. Now, skill completes the structure. If you are a man watching this, understand something equally important. The woman who has few female friends is not automatically broken, but she may be in the middle of reconstruction. If she chooses growth, she becomes deeply self-aware and relationally precise. If she chooses stagnation, she becomes guarded and distant. The difference is discipline. If you are the woman in this process, this is your turning point. Not into forced sociability, into controlled expansion. The path forward is deliberate, and this is only one layer. In the next video, we go deeper into the psychology of projection between women and why certain personalities trigger collective defense mechanisms. If you want to understand the full structure, watch that next. Subscribe if you are building yourself consciously instead of unconsciously repeating patterns. This is not about collecting friends. It is about mastering identity. And once identity is mastered, connection becomes choice, not need, not fear. Choice. That is a different life. And you build it slowly, with structure, with awareness, with control.